legal framework of citizenship deprivation in Assam within the context of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, the issue is really at the core a very, very legal issue as much as it is a political or policy issue. And we hope Mohsin can, take us through the very, I would say, the fairly complex legalese of the entire situation. Then we have Pamela Philippos, who's an ombudsperson at The Wire and former senior associate editor at the Indian Express. And Pamela is going to actually talk about something on which, on which we should have had more conversations till now, but we haven't. But I'm glad she's going to talk about that, which is the multiple exclusions of women in the citizenship verification process in Assam, because the way the challenges that women, including married women, have faced within the citizenship determination regime in Assam is very exclusive and very distinctive case study of the gendered impact of the entire citizenship determination process. And of course, all of this, we hope Pamela will make sense of this within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, we have Nevenka Kapisic, who's a project coordinator at the Roma youth organization called Walk With Us, Firana Manka in Montenegro. And we have Nevenka here to give us a sort of a broader sort of global perspective and also talk about a little bit about the Together We Can report in itself. And the specific case of Roma statelessness in Montenegro. I think when it comes to preventing statelessness and making sort of legal policy or advocacy interventions at various levels, I think it's extremely crucial for us to connect to other global examples, international examples in other countries and how statelessness processes work there. We'll, of course, have Ravi Himadri, who's the Director of Development and Justice Initiative and also a co-founder of the Right to Nationality and Citizenship Network, open the discussion with a bit on some more details on the Together We Can report and the CSF consortium and what the report intends to achieve, right, through its evidence-based research that the authors of the report have done. You can see the Q&A option for the audience. You can see the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. Once all the speakers have exhausted the remarks, we will open the floor to discussions, perhaps interspersed with a few comments from the moderators, including Ravi and myself. And once we open the floor for discussion, please feel free to drop in your questions. In fact, even when the speakers are speaking, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat, in the Q&A box, and we will take them up as soon as the speakers are done speaking, and we will address them one by one. Once again, thank you all for being here, and thank you for sparing time from your schedules to be with us today for this launch and webinar. And I'm certain we're going to have a very productive session with the panel of distinguished speakers that we have today. And with this, I will pass on the stage to Ravi. Ravi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anshuman, and thank you for all the speakers who are here and the people who are participating and attending this. This is in this webinar, as Anshuman has said, we are primarily going to do two things. One is discuss the Assam issue and also release the Together We Can report, which is a global report on how COVID-19 has impacted stateless populations. And more importantly, the report has a roadmap on what can be done to build back better. So the report is, Elena, can you just display? Yeah, right. So that's a report, cover of the report. So the report is about the COVID-19 impact on stateless people across different countries, and it also has a roadmap for change. The report is brought out by COVID-19 Emergency Statelessness Fund Consortium, and there is 12 partners globally with Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion, coordinating the global work with stateless populations by different organizations supporting the people in these many countries. The COVID-19 pandemic and the state responses to it have had significant negative impact on the lives, well-being, and rights of approximately 15 million stateless people around the world who have been denied nationality, as well as tens of millions who are at risk of losing this nationality. The devastating impacts of exclusion and denial of fundamental rights, including healthcare during the pandemic, relate to much deeper structural problems. The historic and systemic exclusion, deprivation, marginalization of communities that have made stateless as part of wider discriminatory political acts or pursuant to dominant discriminatory ideologies. The report documents these impacts, providing an evidence base for further action. COVID-19 has shown a light on these challenges and also presents a unique opportunity to raise visibility, address the structural causes of statelessness, and secure lasting change through working directly with stateless people and being accountable to them. So the report has basically proposed a three-step roadmap for relevant stakeholders to protect the right to nationality and the rights of stateless people during times of COVID-19 and beyond. So these are important roadmaps which have been suggested. I mean, what is particularly important about this report is that we have proposed a specific roadmap. So one is check for institutional blind spots. The COVID-19 consortium invites states, UN actors, humanitarian groups, and other stakeholders to engage in careful introspection, check for institutional blind spots, and review and reform policies and practices to ensure that stateless people are prioritized, their particular contexts and needs are understood and addressed, and they are not excluded or left behind. Secondly, the consortium invites activists, NGOs to make their expertise available to those in positions of power, to have open consultation and meaningful and constructive dialogue with affected communities. And that's very important. It's extremely important in the whole statelessness discourse to bring in the affected communities and to commit to our set, including stateless people, on equal terms by consulting with activists and affected communities, building trust and strengthening solidarity with stateless communities, meeting the needs and priorities of affected communities and ensuring that meaningful participation and facilitating wider discourse within society and institutions on equality, inclusion, and right to nationality. These are at the root of statelessness in a way, because what we have is basically arises from lack of equality and inclusion. Thirdly, and most importantly, the consortium recommends building back better. So we know that what has happened, and what has happened, the way the stateless populations have been excluded in all countries is nothing unexpected. So we did, I mean, one can, looking at the way stateless populations have been excluded, it was very consequential that stateless populations would be excluded from COVID-19 response as well, and they would be impacted the most. So the consortium recommends that we need to build back better. So the CESF invites all actors to learn the hard lessons and the pandemic has taught us and invest in future proofing, ensuring a lasting commitment to breaking down the pervasive injustice, indignity, inequality, deprivation, and exclusion that stateless people face, focusing on A, implementing reforms to address discriminatory laws, policies, practices, B, redressing the intergenerational disadvantage and legacy of statelessness. And this is very important, because what the stateless people face is intergenerational discrimination against them. C, being accountable to stateless communities and activists. D, monitoring the performance and progress of states, because it's very important to monitor the program, because states may commit that they will reduce statelessness or do away with statelessness, but then it's important to monitor the performance. Lastly, ensuring justice to and reparations for the stateless people, and sustainably investing in inclusive society. These are the very concrete recommendations roadmap that have been made in the We Together We Can report, and these are very important. And these, we hope that we will take forward these recommendations in the coming years. Thank you, and I would like to give it back to Anshuman to carry forward. I hope the link to the report has been put up on the Q&A section.
Yes, thank you so much, Ravi. Thank you so much for that overview of the report. And I think, as you said, one of the most remarkable parts of the report, at least for me, was the roadmap that it lays out. Because a lot of times when it comes to also evidence-based research, policy research, or advocacy research, um, the spectrum tends to end at observations, and recommendations are found few and far between. So I'm glad that this report also lays out a roadmap for change per se. Okay, without wasting any time, we'll just go into the panel of speakers that we have. And to begin with, we have Tanya Lashkar, who's a human rights lawyer in Assam and is currently based in Assam. And as I said before, Tanya will give us an overview of the situation on the ground in Assam with respect to how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the stateless population and the population at risk of statelessness. Tanya, please.
Yeah, thank you, Anshuman. Good afternoon, all. So, yeah, I will talk about what's happening in Assam. And I want to start by reminding you all still from 2020 flood, when in 2020, the big flood happened in Assam. So at that time, one image of a person went viral in social media where he was drying up his citizenship papers in a flood relief camp. The Assam, we know how devastating the Assam floods are and how many people every year dies during Assam flood. But for a person who belonged to a certain class and caste in Assam, the prime focus in that time also was his citizenship papers. This is what happening in Assam. In Assam, the life of the poor and marginalized people is revolve around one question, and that is how not to become stateless and how to defend their citizenships. And that image is one example of such thing. So be it flood, be it pandemic, be it anything, any natural calamities in Assam, the prime focus of the people of Assam is to defend their right to citizenship and their right to not to become stateless. So and justifiably so, because in Assam, in a state like Assam, which is a poor state where three parallel processes are running to inspect upon the citizenship of its people and to determine whether the whole of the inhabitants of Assam, it's not on certain particular section or particular class, but it is about the citizenship of whole of the inhabitant of Assam are in question. And in any time, anyone in Assam can be suspected and as an illegal immigrant, and his citizenship might be in question. And this is why more than 70 people in Assam have committed suicide till today, and they don't know, because they thought that they might not have all the adequate papers to become a citizen, to defend their citizenship, and they might not have adequate, their papers might be inadequate. So 70 or more of our people have committed suicide still now, and we don't know what will happen next. Having said that, I want to focus on what happening during pandemic in Assam. So we all know that during pandemic, on 13 April 2020, an order has been passed by the Supreme Court, and by virtue of that order, almost 300 people were released from detentions, and detentions, because they have spent more than 2 years of their life still now during detention, and now the Supreme Court has given a direction to the state to release them on a personal bond. And I have seen that this news has been celebrated across the print and broadcast media, and it has been said that the justice has been made finally, and now they have been released from detention camp. So it is in a way they have given justice. But I want to do an inspection to that and to see whether it was really whether justice has been already meted to them really, because their release wasn't absolute. Okay, they had to go to the nearest police stations. First they have to give a verifiable address and a bond of 5,000 rupees to get released, and then every week they had to go to the police stations to give a hajira to the police station to ensure their whereabouts in the police station. So the outcome is diluted by this condition, and they although they are released open in the society, but some of their rights has been already curtailed. They can't go anywhere beyond a territory, an area specified by that police station. Otherwise they might again be apprehended. Then secondly, the ratio behind these 2 years is never explained by the court. I don't know on what basis this 2 years limitation has been posed. So I don't know what are the constitutional grounds on which this 2 years limitation is put upon them, and this has never been explained to them. So in such situation, can we say that justice has been meted to them? Finally, they don't know that whether their release is absolute or not. What will happen after the pandemic is over? Whether they will have been again apprehended or not. So this detainability and this detainability and deportability upon their head is not gone. They are still under the threat of detention and deportation. So in such a way, I don't know how people celebrate these orders of Supreme Court. And I think we should again inspect on these orders of Supreme Court and see whether it was justified or not, or whether there should be some other things which remain unaddressed after these orders of Supreme Court, and which should be addressed now. Because there could not be a different constitution or different sets of rules for this for the people of Assam. How could we can say that for the people of Assam 2 years detention is nothing? When a person has been detained for 2 years and then he has been released, and the state do not have proper explanations why they have been detained and why they have been released now. So in such a situation, how could we say that justice have been meted? This is my questions to all the panelists and all the people who are researching in this matter, and I will make an appeal to see I will make an appeal to inspect into these categories and see whether it is another way of making people statelessness or not, whether this is another this order of Supreme Court is giving birth to a new class of citizenship in Assam, who do not enjoy all the constitutional rights, like the constitutional right of movability. The Indian Constitution gave everyone the right to go to anywhere and everywhere they want to within the specific territories of India to do any work that they want to. But this class of citizen, they are now restricted to the jurisdiction of a particular police station, and they cannot move beyond that the jurisdiction of this police station. So this way we are snatching from them their constitutional right of movability. So this is the new class of citizenry. And now in Assam there are two classes of citizenries. One class of citizen who can move beyond the territory of the police station, and they can go anywhere and everywhere, and one classes of citizen who cannot who cannot move beyond the territory of one police station. And the reason behind is it never explained, and the constitutional basis of such order is never explained. Don't know that why they are this special, they are coming to these special categories, that they cannot move beyond this specific territory. Also, like the other there are other rights, like first of all their right of citizenship, which has been snatched. They don't know that will it be reinforced to them, will it affect their offsprings. Like they don't know that their city they whether they can vote again or not, because their citizen, the cloud in the citizenship rights of them is not clear yet. They have been released from the detention camp, but whether they will be a voter or not is not clarified yet. So like this is a one kind of reinforced, this Supreme Court order, I will say, has institutionalized this statelessness of people and is reinforcing their deportability and detainability again on them. And that's why it's we should do more research into it, and we should before declaring that justice have been meted, we should inspect into it more and see what kind of justice we are giving, and what kind of what class of citizen we are again making, and whether we are making a classification between citizens of a particular state, in a particular state. So these are my limited points. Also, I want to share one story of a person and the human cost of all of this citizenship regime which is running running in Assam, and how it is affecting the life of poor and marginalized people. So the Minara Begum is one of such person who spent 11 years of her life into detention camp, and now she has been released during the pandemic after that order, 13 April order of the Supreme Court. So she went to the detention camp with her daughter, who was 14 days of age at that time. Now she had been released, and her daughter is now 10 years, now 11 years of age, and now she is staying with her husband. So when she came out from detention camp, she has seen that her husband has been remarried, and one of her daughter is also been married off. So now she don't know whether she should be angry at her husband because he got remarried, or whether she should be happy that it was the benefit for her children. And so she asks, when we met her, she asked us like, what is my why have what happened to the 11 years of my life, and why I have spent these 11 years of my life into detention camp, whereas my other siblings are verily Indian citizen and they are enjoying all of their rights. So Minara Begum don't know why she has been detained and why she has been released, and I don't have the proper language to explain her, and she is also asking whether she will be again detained, or she again will be sent to she's also asking that if she is not citizen of India, then she is citizen of which country, and why is not she been deported to that country from where the state is suspecting that she is a citizen of. So now I don't have the proper language to explain her all the bilateral treaties and how it is not possible to detain her to Bangladesh because we don't have any bilateral treaty to Bangladesh, and what is it called an indefinite detention camp, and why deportation why our detention was an arbitrary and indefinite detention, and why in absence of a deportation treaty with Bangladesh, detaining a person in absence of a deportation treaty with Bangladesh is an indefinite detention, and how it is a process of making them statelessness. So now she don't know whether her child daughter who was with her in the detention camp, whether she will be a citizen or not, whether she can be because now we know that the law has been changed, and you have to be the son or daughter of both of your parents should be an Indian citizen to be a citizen of India. So we don't know that what is happening to the fate, what will happen to the fate of Shahana, whether she will be a citizen or not. So so in Assam, this is what happening. There is a cloud in the which came out in the citizenship rights of people, and we don't know who are going to be the citizen of India and who are not, and we don't know how to explain those things to our people who are illiterate, who are poor, who do not have proper understanding of all those scenarios. So that's what happening with Assam. The life of people of Assam has become almost unidimensional, and we it revolve around the citizenship question, and we don't know how and we don't have answer to any of this, and we are never been explained, and we have never been explained, and we don't have the we don't know under which categories of constitutional what is the constitutionality behind this process. So and we verily know that the question regarding the section 3 of citizenship act, that is the by birth citizenship, is still pending in Supreme Court. But despite that, the citizenship of people of Assam are being determined, and 19 lakh people are under the threat of losing their citizenship and under the threat of becoming stateless. So this is what happening in Assam, and we have a lot of questions which are unanswered, and we don't know which are not answered under the Constitution of India, and which are not answered under any legal regime or any humanitarian laws that we know, all the protocols, international protocols and all. We don't know what is going to be happened and what will happen to us. We know that there are many protocols and many protocols on not making people statelessness, and India is a party to them, but still there are people who don't know about the fate of their citizenship, whether they are citizen or not, whether they are stateless or not, whether they are whether they are citizen or not. So in such a scenario, there are many questions which are unanswered, and we are awaiting justice, and we are awaiting answers of those questions. This is where I want to stop, and I will add if anything, any queries will be asked to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I think your remarks are very incisive and important, and the spectrum that you covered in terms of directing attention towards really the gradations of statelessness and liminality that the citizenship determination process in Assam is creating. And it's very interesting how you talked about one particular set of citizens being tied to jurisdictions of police stations, while the another set of citizens being having the complete freedom to move around. I think that restriction on mobility itself is very critical to understand this sort of discriminatory gradation of belongingness and citizenship that the citizenship crisis in Assam is creating. And within the context of statelessness, I think it's very important to understand that complexity. Thanks again, Tanya, for your remarks. We'll move on to Mohsin now, who's going to take us through the legal complexities and the legal aspects of Assam's citizenship determination regime within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mohsin, the floor is yours.
Anshuman, just checking if I'm audible.
You are loud and clear.
Thank you so much, Anshuman, and thank you, Ravi, for organizing this event, and all the other colleagues for this excellent report. So Tanya, until now, and I'm assuming the other friends on the panel, will be pointing out a number of key concerns, even pathologies, in the context of citizenship processes in India today. I would like to take advantage of being somewhere in the middle of the panel and further situate this nationality question or citizenship question in a broader legal frame. I believe that the nationality question and the various legal mechanisms associated with it raise some fundamental issues about the way citizenship, not only in India, but in many other parts of the world, is being weakened. I reckon it is also, it also challenges the ordinary ways in which we think about statelessness and its harms, and I think even the future of citizenship itself. Tani has already mentioned some of the stakes of the matter. The most striking, of course, is the scale of the problem. Since 1985, the foreigners' tribunals have declared more than 100,000 persons as foreigners. An extraordinarily larger number, more than 2 million people, have been classified as suspected foreigners through other legal mechanisms. Out of these, of course, 1.9 million have been excluded from the NRC. But there are other mechanisms as well. So India's Election Commission, for instance, has marked more than 300,000 people as doubtful voters or D-voters who may be asked to prove their citizenship in foreigners' tribunals. And these tribunals have become completely notorious for being arbitrary, for declaring people foreigners on minor errors in their documents. And despite being constantly characterized as tribunals, which gives us some sort of an air of judiciousness, these entities neither reflect any meaningful independence from the executive, nor are they, as far as evidence suggests, composed of well-suited or competent people. On each of these grounds, and many more, these citizenship processes violate the international right to nationality. Article 15 of the UDHR is clear. No one can be arbitrarily deprived of one's nationality. The flagrant violation of basic due process norms is arbitrary by definition. Policies that discriminate are also arbitrary by definition. And as I imagine Pamela will point out, the documentary processes in Assam place women in particular distinctly at a disadvantage. To this, I can add numerous other groups, especially children and transgenders, in whose case these policies can be described as exclusionary at best and discriminatory and even inhumane at worst. Now, recently, colleagues at my research center elaborated some of these legal points, and they've also argued that it is also arbitrary for a country to render its nationals stateless. This obligation applies to all countries as a matter of customary international law, even if they may not have ratified the statelessness conventions, as is the case with India. But at this point, let me pivot slightly. I would like to also gesture towards the critique of the very notion of statelessness itself, because I think that the conversations around Assam and NRC, some of things that Tanya has highlighted, and many of our experiences, both working in the field on legal issues or with communities, actually are rather perplexing. And I would like to bring that out to whatever extent I can. Because after all, the Indian state has maintained that it is not rendering anyone stateless. The word we use is that it's threatening or it may lead to statelessness, right? So it seems that our worries, the Indian state would like us to believe, are about an unrealized possibility, an imminent possibility, but only a possibility. And I think we should take this rather awkward posturing seriously, because I feel it points towards what such citizenship processes, as we see in places like Assam and beyond, really do to citizenship. What makes them dangerous and harmful, and I dare say intractable in many ways. So let me identify some of the key features of citizenship deprivation processes in Assam in particular, beyond the question of their scale. So first, in terms of their mode, all this is happening through legal instruments. So whether it is citizenship enumeration, let's say NRC, disenfranchisement, election commission marking people D-voters. By the way, that process There is absolutely no evidence that when the Election Commission marked people on the electoral rolls as D, there was any due process norm which was followed. In fact, numerous freedom of information or right to information applications have shown that the state doesn't have any record of it. Or there are other legal instruments like what I may just call apparent adjudications by tribunals and limited review by the High Court and the Supreme Court. Now, these processes are also highly complex. They work through an intersecting and complicated matrix of procedural rules and substantive rules. And they're difficult not only for ordinary people who are obviously subjected to citizenship deprivation, but they are equally confounding for well-socialized lawyers and professionals. The most paradoxical feature for me, though, is that each of these policies has been legitimated in the name of the law and through the law. The perfect example of this is, of course, the famous Supreme Court, Indian Supreme Court's decision in 2005, Sarbananda Sonowal. This judgment placed the burden of proof of proving citizenship on citizens rather than the state. And the court famously held that these rather extraordinary measures were required because of the constitutional mandate of preventing external aggression. It adopted the language of the rule of law, based very much in the Constitution, but extended the logics of emergency and exceptionalism to citizenship. In very important ways, I think the issue of detention and the way the court has dealt with those matters also reflects the same logic. So Tanya mentioned, for instance, that the Supreme Court ruled on detention and gave a limit of 2 years, but the order itself is not so much of a judgment. There is no reason or justification why they chose a 2-year limit or a range of other limitations. And the reason I believe this order also reflects the same logic is because the background assumption of this particular order is the presumption of detention, rather than treating detention as the last resort. And when there is a presumption of detention and there's a presumption of security threat, of exceptionalism and of emergency, then it seems that the court doesn't need to deliver any justification or doesn't need to deliver any reasons. And this lack of reasons, lack of transparency is actually writ large. It's the hallmark of even the NRC orders of the Supreme Court. So if one goes and tries to find out what is the reasoning in a legal constitutional sense of these orders, one would be, unfortunately, rather disappointed. Now, what is happening here is that all these decisions are being taken in the backdrop of emergency logic, in the backdrop of exceptionalism, even though all these policies are being legitimated in the name of the Constitution and in the name of the rule of law. And finally, of course, there are the consequences. The Indian state has not formally revoked people of their citizenship, but has generated and continues to generate at unprecedented scale precarious citizenship. This precariousness is marked by insecurity, by uncertainty. And there's a specter of liminality, a very appropriate word which Anshuman also used, which I think describes quite well the condition of people who are currently subjected to these citizenship deprivation processes. So individuals with their families are not even in, let me say, in the waiting room of citizenship. Citizenship in a fundamental sense has just been made inapplicable to them. Now take the case of people who are currently excluded from the NRC, the National Register of Citizens. After a long, tortuous process of years of presenting documents, of hunting for documents, of traveling long distances in order to convince bureaucrats through documents that they are, after all, Indian citizens, the state is yet to issue rejection orders so that people can challenge their exclusion. And the ongoing COVID crisis has just become, it appears to me, another reason why such delays should happen. Ironically, even those people who were included eventually in the final NRC, or the so-called final NRC, which I'll come to in a second, but were initially left out of what was called the draft NRC temporarily, even they cannot use their national identities to get state benefits because their identities have been locked. And it seems, we just don't know when their identities will be revealed again. And again, these questions of uncertainty come back again and again, also often. At the moment, for those who are not aware, even the finality of the NRC is under question. It has become deeply politicized, which doesn't seem to me to be very surprising at all. But we are currently in a situation that after years of creating the citizenship enumeration process that subjected people to untold misery in many ways, we still do not know what will come off this particular citizenship process. The most heart-wrenching stories I have personally heard from people are those who've been marked as D-voters by the Election Commission. Let me just take a minute and tell you one story, because it's important to sort of foreground the stories of individuals who are going through this crisis. And also, I think it reveals a paradoxical, ironic, tragic nature of these processes. So there's one person whose name I'm changing, Rahima Khatun, who I had met along with a few colleagues 1 year ago in Borpeta, a district near Guwahati in Assam. She comes from an extremely poor and unlettered background. And in 1997, it appears that the Election Commission marked her as a doubtful or a D-voter. As I said, there was no due process. There's no evidence that any transparent mechanism was followed in order to identify people as suspected foreigners. She came to know about this years later, when she was going to cast a vote and she was stopped from doing so. But she didn't really understand what all this really meant. And it took her years to fully comprehend the consequences of the actions of this bureaucratic behemoth. When she started hearing stories of people being detained, people being declared foreigners, people being taken to foreigners' tribunals and never coming back home. And that led her to complete paranoia, almost a psychological breakdown, a nervous breakdown. She started to hide, she started to run away from home. Each time she heard that the police is coming into the village, she would just go and hide in some corner of the village. She essentially had started getting, she was suffering from a complete psychological breakdown. She attempted suicide. And then finally she approached a lawyer. And it appears that the lawyer took a fair bit of money from them and said that he will try and resolve this issue. But nothing really transpired. Now, looking back, I think what really may have happened, and this is the ironic sort of part of the story, what really may have happened is that the lawyer may just have taken the money from her, partly to also perhaps bribe the government officials or the police, only to get a notice from them for Rahima, which a suspected foreigners notice, so that she's called to the foreigners tribunal and the sense of uncertainty would end. Now, the irony here is that she had to give money. She had to practically, indirectly, potentially bribe somebody only to get a suspected foreigners notice. Nothing really happened. And when we were talking to Rahima, there was no development on the case. But there's an additional irony, perhaps even a bigger irony, that suppose she does get a notice from a foreigners tribunal today. In all probability, she actually will be declared a foreigner by a foreigners tribunal, because these foreigners tribunals work in such an arbitrary fashion. Also because the Guwahati High Court has consistently refused to exercise judicial review on declaring people or marking people D by the Election Commission. So what essentially is happening in these cases is a person is being thrown into a legal black hole. But the moment they start using their legal rights in order to address the condition of uncertainty, the condition of illiminality, they are more likely to be even formally declared to be a foreigner rather than just being in a gray zone of citizenship. What all this reflects, in my view, is that these policies have not and perhaps will not, or might not even be fundamentally designed to result in a formal loss of citizenship. Citizens rather are stuck, and their stuckness is marked not by a journey towards statelessness or any other identifiable condition, but suspension, if you may. And this is just to go back to Tanya's important words when she kept saying that we don't know, or we are waiting for answers. That is fundamentally the condition of suspension or stuckness, which we see in the citizenship context in Assam. On other occasions, I've called these policies irregularization of citizenship. So the state policies in, like NRC or other such policies in Assam, they do not revoke citizenship, they irregularize citizens. Moving ahead, the question for us is, how should we fully appreciate this harm of citizenship dispossession, which will perhaps always be hidden behind legal hubris, might even escape our ordinary definitions of statelessness, but indicate, I believe, the real tragedy of citizenship today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mohsin, for very insightfully explaining the legal aspects. I think this is the Assam story of citizenship crisis is a multidimensional story, and the legal chapter of this story, to me, is pivotal to understanding, the core of the crisis here. And as you said, like a lot of us have been struggling for a long time to actually lay our finger or give a name, describe or characterize rather the sort of liminality, the unique liminality that the processes in Assam have created. And it's interesting how you use the word stuckness. I think that's a very apt description of the sort of the uncertainty that people in Assam face because of these processes, and a lot of it has to do with, as you said, the exceptionalism, the ideology of exceptionalism that the legal framework applies here. So I think those comments were very helpful. Before we move on to Pamela, we have a very, very short film that we would like to screen. This film actually depicts the experiences of the released detainees in Assam, and also somewhere goes back to what both Tanya and Mohsin have talked about, this sense of uncertainty, this sense of peculiar liminality that the released detainees are stuck in at the moment, right? It's a story of suffering, it's a story of bereavement and pain, and also it's a story of great anxiety, right? And as Tanya said, in the gradation of stateless citizens or citizens at risk of statelessness, I think the released detainees, they form a they occupy a very, very distinct space. So yes, Elena will help us watch the film, and the film goes on for about 8 to 9 minutes, post which we'll move on to Pamela. Elena, please. Thank you.
একদিন আমার কাছে একটা নোটিশ আইলো, বাংলাদেশি নোটিশ আইলো। নোটিশ আসার পরে তাহলে আমি ওইখানে রইলাম, ওরাও কোনো কিছু কয় নাই, আমিও কিছু কই নাই, ওইখানে রয়েছি। থাকতে 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 2016-তে আমার ধরে নিই। আমি যখন ধরে নেয় তখন আমি ওই যে জালের কাঠি যে বানায়, আমি ওই কাঠি কাটতাম। আমি আসছিলাম ওই জায়গায় কাজ করতেছি, বাঙালি বাসায় কাজ করতে সময় আমি চা খেয়ে আইবা নিচ্ছি, তখন রাস্তার থেকে তারা ধরছে। কেনা ধরছে? এটা বর্ডার পুলিশে 2016-তে আমার ক্যাম্পে পাঠিয়েছে। এটা দিল গোয়ালপাড়া ডিটেনশন ক্যাম্প।
Detention is the worst aspect of the citizenship verification exercise in Assam. People declared as foreigners by the Foreigners Tribunal are sent to 6 detention centers in Assam. Many have spent more than 10 years in detention.
ক্যাম্পে নিয়ে গেলে পরে আমাকে চিবাচিবির মধ্যে থাকছি, বিরাট কষ্ট, খাওয়া দাওয়ারও কষ্ট।
খাওয়া দাওয়া তো এইরকম ফার্স্টে এইরকম খাওয়া দাওয়া ছিল, মানে ডাল যে রাঁধছে নাই লবণ নাই মরিচ, এইরকম এনে তো খাওয়াই যায় না। আর না খাওয়া তার জীবনটা তো বাঁচান নেবো কোনো রকম।
আর ওষুধ পাতি ভালো ওষুধ দেয় না, খালি অন্য ওষুধ দিয়ে থাকে, যে ওষুধ খানাকবে ওষুধ দেয় না। তারপরে একটা ডেলিভারি পেটে নিয়ে গেছিলাম, বাচ্চা নিয়ে গেছিলাম পেটে, 3 মাসের ডেলিভারি ছিল। পরে সেই 7 মাস 8 মাস হইলো, এইটা আমাকে টিটি বেজি দিল। টিটি বেজি দিলি পরে বাচ্চাটা আর পেটের মধ্যে নড়াচড়ার কারণে পরে 3 দিন বাদে বাচ্চারা মরাতা জন্মিল। আমাকে নিয়ে যাও মেডিকেল, আমাকে খুব হারাহাস্তি করছে, আমি যাব না, দেখ খুব হারাহাস্তি করছে, মার দিছে বাদরা।
Life in detention centers is not easy for the detainees who are cramped up in those overcrowded spaces with very little or no privacy and human dignity. They are not even allowed to meet any visitors except their families, nor they are permitted to leave even in case of any death or other emergency in their families. Just like Mamiran Nessa, Halima Khatun, Rajkumar Mondal and Faisal Bipari, most of the people who have been dealing with citizenship issues in Assam are poor, illiterate and from historically marginalized communities, particularly having Bengali ethnicity.
আমার দুধের বাচ্চা থেকে গেছিলাম, গুদা বাচ্চা থেকে আমি ডিটেনশন ক্যাম্পে থেকে আসছি। আমি দুটা বলতে আসাল, একবার পুলিশে দিয়েছে বলতে, দুটা বেয়েছে পয়সা আমার 50,000 দাও, আমি একদিনে বাই করে দিই। একদিনে তো বাই করে দিল না, পয়সা নিয়ে গেলো, টেহাও নিয়ে গেলো, নিয়ে গেলো, আর মানুষ জেলখানায় থেকে গেলো।
একটা ছাগল বেচছে, গরু বেচছে, বিক্রি করে আর মাইকের কাছে চাইয়া চিনতে ঘর একটা বেচা হয়েছে। আমার এখনো ধরেন মোটামুটি 4.5 লাখ 5 লাখের মতন গেছে।
Even as detention was traumatic for the detainees themselves, it was no less tragic for their family members. Detainees leave behind small children without having anyone in the family to support, nor there is any government service to take care of such children. In some cases, a few members of the families left behind even died of trauma.
তো ওইভাবে পড়াটাও বন্ধ হয়ে গেল গা, আমি তো ডিটেনশন ক্যাম্পেই রইলাম। তারপরে মেয়েটার তো বিয়ে হয়ে গেল গা। তো আমগরের মধ্যে তো এই যে কন্যা দান করা হইলো বিরাট তো একটা নিজেরই একটা মেয়া, সেই মেয়াটা বিয়ে দেবো, নিজে দান করে দেবো, সেই দানটা করবার পারলাম না।
পোলানের পড়াশোনা বাদ দিল এই ব্যাপারে, বড় কিন্তু মেট্রিক দিত, মেট্রিক পরীক্ষা দেওয়াল না তো এই পয়সা বেগরে এই জেলখানায় না গেলে পোলান পড়া হারতাম। জেলখানা যাওয়া নেই যে পোলান পড়া নষ্ট হয়েছে। 3 বছরের বাচ্চা থেকে 3 বছরের বাচ্চা দুধের বাচ্চা থেকে গেলাম, সেই বাচ্চা তো কোনো মানুষ নাই, খেলে না মানুষ নাই। সেই বাচ্চাটা কান্দা থাকছে, বাপ আমার স্বামী নিয়ে থাকছে, স্বামী পরে স্বামীটার বিরাট হারাহাস্তি হয়েছে, স্বামীটার না খায় স্বামীটা হাত ফেলে স্বামীটা মারা গেছে।
3টা ছেলে যে আমার মারা গেছে।
কেমনে মারা গেছে?
এই তারা ওই যে পানিতে পড়ে, ধরেন বাপের আমার জেলে পড়ে রয়েছে, আমার টেনশন বিরাট। ওই জায়গায় নাকি খেলাধুলা নেই, কি যেন হয়েছিল, ওই জায়গায় খাড়াইছিল, পুলিশের দিকে ধাওয়া, তখন যায় নিয়ে পানিতে জাপ দিয়ে পড়ে গেছিল। দেখবার জায়গারও কথা,
তারা সুইসাইড করে দিচ্ছে।
ওই সময় সুইসাইড করলো।
Mamiran Nisa's husband and Faisal Bepari's 3 sons, Rafiqul Bepari, Sahidul Bepari and Sirajul Haq, were all collateral victims of this inhumane practice of detention. In 2019, the Supreme Court of India passed an order to release those who had completed 3 years. In 2020, in view of COVID-19, the Honorable Court again decreased the detention limit to 2 years. More than 600 were released. However, a stringent condition was imposed. The released detainees have to report to the police station in their area on a weekly basis.
লকডাউন পড়ছে, আমার তো বিরাট কষ্ট হয়েছে। কলকাতা থানায় হাজিরা দেয় নাকি, সপ্তাহে প্রতি মঙ্গলবারে যায় নাকি, তাই আমার যাবার ভাই না, গাড়ি মোটর নাই। পরে আসতে সময় আইসাই না, পরে আইতে এই পথ আসি আইসে আমার বেমার হয়ে গেল। তো হেনে গেছে যাই পরে মেলা টাইম লাগে, 6 ঘন্টা নাকি। তারপরে আমি সরকার থেকে দরখাস্ত দিলাম যে আমাকে মুনগুড়ি থানায় ফেলালে আমার অল্প সুবিধা হবো, তা সরকার সেই ব্যবস্থা আমাকে করে দেয় নাই।
বাড়ির থেকে বিরাট কষ্ট করে বাইর করছে, বাড়ির তো পয়সা পাতি নাই, সব শেষ। থাকারও তো এইরকম অসুবিধা হয়েছে, নদীর পাড়ে বাড়ি, এই যে সামনে নদী, 6-7 বার বাড়িঘর ভাঙলই। এদিক দিয়ে ভাঙ্গে আসে, ওই দিকে নেই, আবার ভাঙতে ওই দিকে যায়, আরও ওই দিকে যায়, আবার যখন ওই দিকে যায় তখন আবার এদিকে মাটি ওঠে, আবার উল্টা আবার এদিকে আসি।
এই অসুবিধা হয়েছে, এই মাসের সত্যি খেলে বিয়ে ভাঙ্গা দেয়, বাংলাদেশে এসে বাংলাদেশে মেয়ে নেন দেবো না। কত কষ্ট করে, কত ধাপ পারে সিগির ফাঁসি আমার তো পারে না।
Even upon their release, it was difficult for the detainees and their families to cope with the impacts of COVID-19. Their families have already spent large amounts of money on their release and are now left with little financial resources.
কেউ যদি কয় যে আমার আজকে কাম আছে, অল্প কামহানি করে দে, ওই কামহানি করি, আসার সময় কিছু পয়সা দেয়, ওই রকম করে কতদিন চলতে পড়ে গেল লকডাউন। তো একদিন তো গেছি বরগোলা কাম করবেন নাকি, আসার সময় দেখি সামনে মানে পুলিশ আমাক বগলা এসে কয় মার, আর এই বেলে উল্টা যে মারলো না, আমি তো সাইকেল নিয়ে গেলাম পড়ে।
Their statelessness means they have restricted access to government-issued identity cards. Considering that vaccination requires at least one national identity card means they could be excluded. This also means that the released detainees have had restricted access to economic relief packages too. Another trauma that is now waiting to unfold is their exclusion from NRC, the National Register of Citizens.
যে ভোটার হইলাম, ধরেন এই যে সোরবাটা থেকে এই জায়গায় ভোট দিছি, এই ভোটের মধ্যে ধরেন আমার কোনো হইলো না, 2-4 বার আমি ভোট দিলাম, দেওয়ার পরে আমার ভোট কাটা গেল।
এনআরসির কাগজ নাই, এনআরসির নাম আয় না একটা, আবার এই আধার কার্ডের একটা ফিঙ্গারও হয় না। আমার এনআরসির নাম নাই, 2টা ফলাহানের নাই, আমারও নাই, আমার ভাইয়েরও নাই।
The entire structure of the foreigners tribunal is very problematic. The law which adjudicate cases before the foreigners tribunal is the Foreigners Act 1946, which is a colonial act and which was enacted to deal with the foreigners and not with people who were once regarded as Indian citizens or whose family members are Indian citizens. Secondly, the cases are adjudicated by the members who are not experienced enough. Another problem is an executive interference. The government interferes a lot, which compromises with the independence of judiciary. A lot of peoples are declared foreigners because they don't have access to good lawyers. That is another major problem. But whatever it may be, at the end of the day, peoples are declared foreigners for minor anomalies in their names, in their ages.
আমার কে বাংলাদেশি বানাইলো? আমি তো কোনো বাংলাদেশি না, আমার কাগজপাতি সব ঠিক আছে।
আমার কার দরকার কেন? আমরা তো এই দেশেরই মানুষ, ইন্ডিয়ানেরই মানুষ। আমার কাপঠাপ কিছুই লাগে না। আমগরে বর্তমানে আমগরে লাগে, আমরা ইন্ডিয়ান মানুষ, আমগরে করে দেওয়া লাগে।
They are not alone. Many are still languishing in detention centers of Assam. Meanwhile, the foreigners' tribunals have been sending notices to people with pending cases even during the pandemic. This is when uncertainty prevails for the 1.9 million excluded from the NRC. The need of the hour in the middle of this pandemic is to stop detention of those declared foreigners and lessen the burdensome weekly police reporting procedures for released detainees. Immediate steps need to be taken to remove barriers to their inclusion in social welfare and relief programs.
All right, I think this film gave us a very, very comprehensive, profound, and a very tragic glimpse of the impact that both the citizenship crisis and COVID-19 pandemic has had on the released detainees Assam. If you want to know more about exactly how the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly the first wave of the pandemic last year, affected state service delivery and provision of humanitarian relief to the at-risk population in Assam, you might want to go and check out our report, which was published earlier this year. In fact, which was published last year on this particular issue. You will find the report in the chat box. The report is called Impoverished and Marginalized in Assam. And it's an evidence-based and survey-based report that we published to understand exactly how these people have been affected by this double layer of crisis. All right. Now we'll move on to Pamela. And Pamela is going to talk a little bit about exactly how the citizenship crisis has affected women in Assam. And as Mohsin has said, it's been a very distinctive kind of effect. And Pamela will tell us more about it. Pamela, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the Right to Nationality and Citizenship Network, Ravi Himadri, Anshuman, of course, and my fellow panelists, to whom I really listened with rapt attention. Tanya's experience from the ground was so poignant that anyone listening to her would really have tears in their eyes. As also Mohsin gave a very, very structured presentation of the legal backdrop to which this entire tragedy is playing out. Statelessness is the outcome of forced migration or the state-directed othering of a community deemed as foreigners. We need to recognize here the displacement of a reality, the reality of nationality that is given by the state. And what happens is that while the citizen is the defense of the visibility of the country's constitution, the stateless person is the shadow of that. The citizen is articulate. We are able to speak, we are able to protest, we are able to move, a point that Tanya highlighted time and again. The alien is inaudible, invisible, and under these new conditions, cannot even exercise the right to free movement, something that is given to him or her through the Constitution. What we are seeing then in this entire NRC process that has played out in Assam, and that Assam is important because what happens in Assam could be then actually mainstreamed across the country. And that's what caused all those many women and men to come out on the streets in the anti-car protests that we saw. Many of the people in Shaheen Bagh, for instance, told me that it's not us sitting in the cold here under the tent. It is what we fear will happen to us and our children 20 years down the line, sitting in detention camps. So that is the worry. And that's why Assam is so important. That's why it's so important to keep looking at Assam and also documenting the Assam, as this film so beautifully did. We know that the final draft published in August 2019 had excluded 19.06 lakh of 3.3 crore applications for lack of adequate documents to establish them as Indian citizens. We also know that each of the 1906 lakh people left out of the draft NRC is required to approach the nearest foreigners tribunal within 120 days of receiving a rejection slip for reviewing their citizenship claims. Now the COVID and all the lack of staff and so on has created a monstrous situation. People are waiting for these rejection slips. They're not coming. And now the matter is sub judice because it's in court, and the state government of Assam has also got its own agenda and wants certain names lifted out of the NRC. So we see this not just as a plain, it's state directed, but it's also political directed. Politics is what is driving this, and we should understand that. The politics of communalism is what's driving this. So this process, so full of twists, turns, hurdles, and cul-de-sacs, is designed to punish people who have committed no wrong apart from the accident of birth into a community marked foreigner. All studies, including the one conducted by the Development and Justice Initiative, have highlighted how this conscious stripping of personhood has disproportionately impacted women as they are pushed back into an era. Remember, women, the Constitution gave women the right to vote. But before that, women didn't have the right to vote. And now many women in Assam are going to face that situation of being without a vote, with their citizenship being stripped from their personhood. The NRC process in Assam revealed how many women lack the most basic documents to prove their existence. For those born before 1987, proving their own birth may be enough. But those born between 87 and 2004, they would have to prove citizenship of one of their parents. And for those born after 2004, citizenship of both parents would have to be proved, as Tanya had highlighted. Many don't even have a birth certificate. Although the Compulsory Registration of Births and Deaths Act was brought in 1969, according to the National Family Health Survey, only 3 in 5 children, 62.3% in 2015-2016, under the age of 5, had their births registered. So in other words, the failure of these women and men to produce a birth certificate, whose fault is that? It's a fault of the state. And they're being punished for the fault of the state. And that's the irony of the situation. Apart from the lack of birth certificate, one of the major reasons why women particularly don't have the necessary papers is lack of schooling and early marriage. Most leave school early, therefore don't have documents like school leaving certificates or board examination papers. They don't have birth certificates linking them to their parents, and they end up migrating to their husbands' villages. So while they have a ration card, or maybe they have a voter card linking themselves to their husbands, their entire backstory as a human being is in a black hole. So here again, we see societal and family arrangements working against women's chances of belonging. Women have also paid a high cost for administrative failures. Many have found themselves excluded from the list of bona fide citizens on the basis of small discrepancies in the way their names or the names of their fathers or grandfathers are spelled. While men too have fallen victim to this, women specifically have their own set of problems, including the fact that very often their own names, their birth names, are changed after marriage. So, I mean, which is their identity that is being recognized by the state? It's difficult to say. So here we see that it is societal and familial arrangements that work against a woman's right to selfhood and citizenship. Look at the many, many interweaving, intersectional, deprivations that they face in their struggle to claim their citizenship. Lack of clarity on the status of the Gao Panchayat certificate affected women far more because it was they who most needed such linkage documents from the panchayat head or their husbands or fathers' villages, vouching for their birth or their marriage. All this could only be done through a Gao Panchayat certificate. But even this, there's no clarity on the status of this document. The Guwahati High Court in February 2017 pronounced that such certificates were invalid. Some months later, the Supreme Court ruled that their use was valid as sufficient proof of citizenship and linkage, but added this has to have due and proper verification. Now you can see, as Mohsen explained, there's so many ways in which, this is not a law. These are not legal. They're legal instruments by name. But in terms of how the law plays out, it's completely lawless, and people are facing huge problems in their lives because of this. The lack of, we are seeing that this is what we are going into in the future as well, And I like to highlight, everyone had a small story, and I like to highlight one from the Darji study, which was the poignant case study of 58-year-old Fahima Nessa of Santipur village. And her name was not included in the NRC because she said the whole process of submitting documents again and again was very confusing. Can you blame her? Then she said, my son had to take time off from work to fill out the NRC forms. I gave my Gao Panchayat certificate because of the NRC website. But they said that I have to submit it. It was rejected. It was rejected, and they said there's no recognition for this document. So finally she asked, I've lived here all my life. Why do I have to prove I'm not a Bangladeshi? It's a question that, it's an impossible question, It's like saying that, someone turns up at your door and says, you don't have the right to live here. Being unlettered proves a huge burden to people like her. Because it makes for great asymmetries of information. And as many cases, and everyone pointed that out as well, that, a hearing may be announced, a hearing date may be announced, but that information doesn't reach the poor woman. Or a change in the documents may be pronounced, but again, it may not reach the person who it impacts so directly. So we are seeing these anomalies multiply as time goes by. Finally, many women are damned for being from the Muslim community. Personnel running the foreigners' tribunals have actually explained this. Many of them, if they have worked as honest people, have tried to be careful about the people they're eliminating. But they themselves have been thrown out because they have not disqualified a sufficient number of Muslims. If that isn't evidence of the communal nature of this exercise, there's nothing else that needs to be told. What is striking when you consider all these realities together is the absolute insensitivity of the state to the plight of the woman who is damned for the structured discriminations she faces. Poor birth documentation, incomplete schooling, early marriage, lack of literacy, lack of clarity on policies, and communal politics. And as we saw, the pandemic has made a fraught situation worse. It has emptied out pockets. One whole year of managing without jobs, without family income. On top of that, they are now required, if they get their rejection slips, they're required to start all over again, looking out for those elusive linkage documents. And the kind of money that's required both in transportation and payments of officials and so on, it's amazing. Ordinary people cannot afford it. It means that if you don't have money, you're not an Indian citizen. Is that what we have to kind of gain from this? It's really quite ridiculous. And when you consider that India is a signatory of so many international, statements and policies and so on, take something very basic, like Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the family as an integrated unit and as a natural and fundamental group unit of society. But here, what we are seeing is families torn asunder, children being thrown out of the families they were born into, women not being able to claim their right to belong to a family. And those very sad stories, of people going back to their village. The story that Tanya told us of this woman who goes back and finds her husband married to someone else. Her whole life, after 11 years in a detention camp with a small child. Remember, that small child cannot claim Indian citizenship, not just now, but to perpetuity, because that is the nature of the beast. And we have to actually, put forward our various thoughts on this and recommendations. And I'm so glad that this process is ongoing. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. I think, as you said, the reason why we need to look at Assam is because it's a model that can be very well replicated elsewhere. It's really a very pinpoint prototype of a certain exclusionary process that could then be extrapolated. And also, more importantly, thank you for shedding light on how exactly the citizenship process in Assam have been affecting women. In fact, it's clear from your comments that the woman and womanhood and how the processes affect womanhood can become a lens for us to really understand the worst of the citizenship determination regime in Assam and the most serious impacts of the regime on people, right? And as most exclusionary processes, the crisis in Assam also is very, very gendered and intersectional. The impacts are very, very intersectional. And I think the way you explained it, I think it's very comprehensively explained how this is so. Next, we'll move on to Nevenka, who will talk a bit about the Together We Can report. And alongside that, she'll also tell us about Roma statelessness and her experience of making interventions within that. Nevenka, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anshuman. It's truly a privilege to be a part of the Together We Can launch in India, and an honor to speak on behalf of the Roma community in Montenegro, but also a tremendous honor to speak on behalf of the consortium that I gathered in a crucial moment of overall chaos and emergency that left out stateless people. consortium consists of organizations from very different parts of the world, but it showed that the problem of statelessness is universal. Consortium members have been delivering field research, podcasts, specific advocacy activities tailored to each country context, trying to provoke the ones who are responsible and simply to raise the issue in general. Today, I will take you through some of the things that we as Consortium COVID-19 Emergency Statelessness Fund witnessed and learned about the hardship of statelessness living, what we've done about it, and what needs to be done. I would like to cover three things: food and water as one, vaccines, which is pretty basic, and progress. In the state of emergency relief system has to be there for every person in need. No exceptions, no questions asked. I'm not even going to say should, because should leaves room for misuse, and that simply cannot happen, or at least cannot happen again. It has to go to every person in need. A common thread in the findings of consortium was that COVID-19 relief aid was prioritized and that stateless people weren't on the lists. It happened here in Montenegro, in Central Asia, in Dominican Republic, in North Macedonia, and we've seen from the video also that it happened in India. Exclusion of stateless people from emergency relief shouldn't be a predictable outcome. Instead, it needs to be binding for all states to provide for people residing on their territory. When the pandemic started, food and drinking water, not to mention hygiene products, were out of the reach for so many stateless people. Alia, he's a stateless Roma from Montenegro, described it well when we were filming a documentary. He said, we weren't living as humans should. The Roma community in general is the most affected one in Montenegro, and the statelessness dominantly occurs in that community. And in the time of COVID, they had even more difficulties. As the beginning, they couldn't get out and collect secondary raw materials. Same happened everywhere else in the world, which was their primary source of income. They had nothing to sell and then no money to buy any food. Their movement was restricted, as for all of us, but for them, it meant they cannot search for the containers for scraps of food. So the statement, not living like humans, is actually pretty accurate and vivid description. Second, vaccines. In the time of pandemic, a rational thing to do is to vaccinate everyone as soon as possible. Not just people of certain color, certain gender, and with a certain paper. Stateless people are trying to preserve their health, but without an actual healthcare system. Every doctor's appointment needs to be paid for, every medicine as well. We've seen that the virus doesn't care about IDs, so the governments shouldn't care about it too. I mean, when it's a matter of vaccines that are there to stop the spread of the infectious diseases. All safe when everyone is safe. I guess that should be our parole. Otherwise, we're just going in circles, especially since the virus is adapting to us much faster than we're adapting to him as it occurs. It changes somehow its form in some ways, and so should us change our norms simply. Third is the progress. And this I want to connect with other two categories. So no matter how small organization is, if we pressure institutions over and over, change is possible. The idea of the achievable progress under our small pressure has been revealed through the work of consortium. Over 50 Roman Egyptian families here in Podgorica in the very beginning of the pandemic, in the first wave, Podgorica is the capital of Montenegro, have been living without access to water more than 2 years. We're talking about access to clean drinking water. When the pandemic started, our organization simply pressured constantly the local government to install drinking water to these families. And within 2 weeks, we achieved something that was stagnating for 2 years. Then when the first immunization plan came out, stateless people were at the very bottom. But our journalists from our organization started asking questions, simply arguing the validity of the decision. And that resulted in expanding the immunization plan and opening the vaccines for people without documentation. So similar progress, open dialogues with institutions, a start of meaningful cooperation with civic society organizations has occurred throughout the consortium. We are proud for every little achievement, but aware of the work ahead of us. Roma Youth Organization, Pirena Mensa, with the support of the ISI, recently did a mapping of statelessness in Podgorica. And the research revealed 188 adults and 216 children with unregulated legal status at a risk of statelessness. This number doesn't exist in official data. Our research has shown us that in future, this number will absolutely multiply if we don't react now, because already the number of kids with unsolved legal status is bigger than the number of adults. Here we don't have the gender issue, but we do have a nonsense that regulation of the legal status of kids requires that both parents have resolved legal status. And that is such a waste, not to use that the status of one parent automatically is the status of a child, simply because that would be in child's best interest. Nevertheless, we are proud to say that we have a window open now in communication with the Minister of Internal Affairs that is in charge for the matter of legal status and citizenship. And hopefully we will be able to use this connection and solve some of the concrete cases who have been living stateless lives since the war in Kosovo that was more than 2 decades ago. Pamela in her story mentioned confusing procedures, and it's like that everywhere, obviously. Procedures are way too complicated for stateless people, people who are mainly illiterate, especially when it comes to Roma community in Montenegro. We need to be present, a constant reminder that the matter of statelessness needs a structural, systemic change, meaning to acknowledge failures within the system, share information, especially digitally, and allocate concrete funds for it. Then stateless people should be involved in the entire process, which means consult with us, work with us. This may not be our last pandemic, certainly not our last climate crisis, and therefore we need to be prepared and solve the current humanitarian crisis of statelessness before it gets worse. That's why we need to reform policies and monitor the entire process. Doesn't matter how small of the organization is. Those are the recommendations of the consortium based on the findings from the field, from the people living a stateless life. Legal status, citizenship, it's not just a document. It's a permission to get a vaccine at the same time as everyone else, permission to learn in the same conditions as everyone else, to get a free meal a day, a social insurance, a job. Mohsin and Tanya said that the process is stuck, and they're both right. It's same here. Institutions are comfortable in taking as little as they can. But together we can, roadmap is clear and straightforward. So let's make sure people in charge hear us all. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Nevenka. I think it's extraordinary how striking the similarities are between conditions of statelessness in entirely two different continents. And it's as if this, stateless people around the world are tied together by their condition. And it's interesting how particularly you talked about, how the stateless Roma population has been at the bottom of the priority ladder for the state. and pretty much the same in Assam. They have been cut off from critical service deliveries. They have been cut off from emergency humanitarian relief. And you've talked about something that we have missed so far, but is extremely important. I hope to bring it up in the discussion after this, is access to COVID-19 vaccines. I think that's extremely crucial. Given that stateless population lie at the at the bottom rung of the priority list for governments, I think they have also fallen out of the immunization coverage. So thank you for bringing that up. And also thank you for giving us an overview of the various levels of interventions and advocacy that your organization has done. I think there's a lot to learn from that within the Indian context. So thank you, Nevenka. With that, we have come to an end of the main speaking panel. Subsequently, we'll go to a Q&A session. I don't see many questions on the Q&A box. There's only one question from Indira. In case, I would generally suggest that all speakers here, I would kindly request all speakers here to drop in your email IDs in the chat box and select the option of panelists and attendees, so that anyone who wants to get in touch with you, for instance, Indira, can get in touch with you for their research or any other purpose. But I think we will take this opportunity to ask some questions of our own within ourselves if we have no external questions, and following that we will close the webinar. So let me take the privilege, the moderator's privilege, and ask actually two questions, one to Tanya and another to Mohsin for starters, which is, Tanya, this is again something that I just talked about in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine coverage. Could you tell us a bit about how the immunization coverage, the vaccination coverage has been faring with respect to the at-risk population, including declared foreigners, released detainees, and those whose names have not been in the NRC? Are people facing serious difficulties in accessing vaccines? So that's my question to you. Mohsin, my question to you is something that I've always struggled with, and it's always been up for debate. You talked about the international obligation to prevent statelessness on also India's part, and this is something I guess you have also argued along with your team in your paper. But in terms of the right to the obligation to prevent statelessness being a part of customary international law or being a peremptory norm of international law, how far has that been recognized in general by states around the world, and how concrete is this legal obligation on a country like India, which is not a signatory to the two statelessness conventions? So perhaps Tanya, you can go first, and followed by Mohsin.
Sure. Thanks, Anshuman. So yes, they are facing difficulties in getting secured the COVID-19 vaccine because as it already been discussed, that they need some kind of identifications, and it's also a very online driven process, like to most of the cases you had to register your spot through online. So these are the people who do not have access to internet, who do not have access to other devices, smartphones, etc. So they are facing difficulties, of course, and it is crucial about them is the thing crucial about them is that they are the responsibilities of the state. The state have released them and suddenly without any equipment, and they are now in the society, in this society with the people, but they don't know how to operate in the society, right? So there should be a process to ensure that all of these people who might not have adequate identifications, because they might have because they spend 2 years or more than 2 years. Most of them have spent like 5, 6, 7, 11 years in the jail, so they might not have all the it is not a imaginary fact that they won't have all the identification marks. So there should have been a procedure to ensure that all of them get vaccinated. And also this state has already posed a risk on them by providing this necessity of going to the police stations every week. So they're out there, they have to go to the public every week and go to the public, because they do not, these are the marginalized people, they do not have their own vehicles, they had to go to the use the public transport to go there and give the hajira in the police station, right? So there should have been I think it was the duty of the state to ensure that all of them get vaccinated, but there's nothing is taken in that regard. So they are also like waiting for their turn. Most of them are not vaccinated yet. Some of them get vaccinated in the camps, because nowadays they are organizing camps on the spot vaccinated. So there some of them have got vaccinated, but as far as I know, half of them are not vaccinated yet, and they are going to the public using the public transport to give hajira in the police station, and it's not fair. It's not fair, according to me.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tanya. Mohsin, please.
Thanks, Anshuman. You're right. It's a vexed area of international law at the moment, to the extent I understand. It also appears that a large number of obligations are still what international lawyers like to call evolving customary international law. Now, of course, the question is, how do we characterize the relevant obligation in the present case? A range of obligations are connecting to, let me call it mitigating, without getting to the legalese, mitigating or minimizing the problem of statelessness. And these are obligations that are associated with the statelessness conventions and the protocols, etc. Now, what we try to argue in our report was not directly drawing from the obligations flowing from statelessness itself, but the UDHR obligation, which I think Kamla also averred to, Article 15, which is an obligation which is applicable to India. And that is that India cannot deprive its own nationals arbitrarily. So that right of non-arbitrariness is directly binding. The question is, how do we interpret that obligation? What are the things that amount to arbitrary deprivation of citizenship? And what I believe and what we have argued is that, among other things, if there are legal procedures that are rendering your own citizen, your own national, stateless, then the state has not taken adequate procedures seriously, which would secure that national's future. Now, some people have argued that even this particular question is an evolving area of customary international law, but we'll have to wait and see in which direction ultimately the consensus takes. But I think as far as the Indian situation is concerned, we are happy to stick our necks out and argue that what India is doing to its nationals and the consequences it is having on those individuals who may be rendered stateless, they are not formally stateless, amounts to India's obligation under UDHR, which is a binding obligation to not arbitrarily deprive anybody of citizenship.
Thank you, Mohsin. Before we move on to Ravi, there's a question in the box for Mohsin. So I thought I'd just get it out of the way. Perhaps we would like a little more context to the question. Not sure, but the question says, hi Mohsin, I would like to know what are the main subjects that are yet to be identified within the community of NRC affected Assamese? Do you think we would want some more context on what the question is asking? It's from an anonymous, it's from an anonymous attendee, and whoever this is, I would request you to kindly please elaborate on your question and be a little more specific perhaps. Okay, we have one more question, but we'll wait for, we'll come to this after Ravi has spoken. Ravi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Anshuman. Whereas Tanya has talked about the released detainees and how that is really not a process of setting them at liberty. It's really a very limited kind of a liberty, as they can't move outside. That's a very important question she has raised. And also, as far as Mohsin's, what he spoke about, the kind of liminality in the whole process, and how we need to deal with these questions. But I would like to, ask Pamela, since Pamela is here and she has been working with the media for so long, and she herself also raised the issue of, the need for documenting all these experiences of people who are affected by the citizenship process. And if you can remember, Anshuman, that we ourselves in the Right to Nationality Network, we have debated how to bring all these so many thousands of experiences of the people who are excluded, people who are been in detention, people who are devoters, and so many. I mean, it's extremely important to bring out these experiences. And so, how do we? Media has done a lot, of course. The Assam issue, to some extent, yes, the media has covered it a lot. I mean, there are a lot of reports about detainees and a lot of other stories out there. But really, when you're talking about thousands, how do we do it? How do we? I mean, that's something that we'll have to think about in the coming, months and years. If you can share
Ravi,
with
I
us.
think you already have done fair amount of documentation, and it's impressive. Basically, I think it is important to understand that there are not just one media platform, there are several media platforms. And the way we use each of them to take our messages across becomes very important, including from a simple tweet to something that is, more binding, like a documentary. I think all of you have done that as part of your outreach program. But it is important to understand that we need to also bring in the people we are talking about, the subjects of this. And it's their voices that come out. And that's why I think, the poetry, say, of the Mia poets, for instance, they have found new creative ways to say, to say that we are stamped as illegal, but we are legal. They're claiming their space. So that space claiming, is something that is a very positive and strong voice. And I think a lot of that, I mean, we know the sad stories, but we need to also have these assertions of, statehood and the fact that I'm a citizen. Really, sort of emphasize. So how do we do that? Give people agency. Perhaps it means going back to the people, talking, maybe focus group discussions with them on this. How would they like to tell their story to the world? And of course, so each of these media platforms that exist, from the EPW article to a very short, quint-like 5-minute reads, to little videos that go to people. I think these are all things that we should understand. And perhaps Nevenka can tell us whether they have thought of other media products that could take these stories, because what she talked to us about was quite compelling. That fact is that basic water and potable water is not available to a section of, it's like depriving people of their right to life. If you take out water, what is left? It's a soul condition for life. So I think that needs to be, maybe she can tell us more. But before I go, I just want to respond to Indira Pancholi's, question, whether the CA, NPR, NRC status, at the moment it is frozen. The Ministry of Home has just informed Parliament that the rules have not been made for CAR. CAR is like the mothership, and that is a Citizen Amendment Act. And if the rules for that has not been, it means that the other things, the NRC is the third little bit in this entire torture chamber, as it were. And the second thing is the NPR, and NPR, which is actually the National Population Register. That the data for that has to be yet current, because the state has not gone about the first phase of the census operation. It's been delayed because of the COVID crisis. So in a sense, we have a little bit of breathing space as well, because this entire thing has been put on hold. But remember, the political motive behind this is to keep things in suspension, like a Damocles sword over the heads of people. And that's how the state is going to use it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. And thank you for answering Indira's question. My apologies, I completely missed that first question. I was under the impression it was a previous question that she had asked. Yeah, and also just quickly with reference to what both Ravi and Pamela said, I think in terms of documentation and foregrounding of voices from the ground, I think in my observation till the last 2 to 3 years ago, it was almost negligible, I would say. But when the NRC crisis really picked up, which is when the first draft was published in 2018 and the final draft was published in 2019, August 2019, I think both national media and international media started covering this, as you said. Quint has done a bunch of videos. EPW has done a long form series. Scroll, Arunabh Saikia has done a brilliant human-based story on this, which is literally called Humans of NRC. So I think in the last 2 years, we have seen this foregrounding of voices from the ground along with the faces. And I think that's extremely important to convey the plight of the people on the ground, right? Because this is a larger story that is best told through smaller stories, in my opinion. So yes, and Nevenka, do you want to respond to anything that the others have said?
I would like to add something to what Pamela was saying. Maybe Montenegrin story isn't that applicable in the context and proportion of India, because the media platform here in Montenegro isn't that large. We can, let's say, easily go through and connect with several medias, but what we have done is we made our own media. So it is a first Roma portal in Montenegro, first and only Roma portal in Montenegro. And it's not the issue of portal itself. It's the fact that we were poking, we were asking questions. And when we started asking questions, the government felt not threatened by us, of course, we're way too little for them, but they felt inadequate in that position. So their first impulse was to either not reply at all or reply with something concrete. We also used the shift in the government. So after 30 years of the one party who was leading the country, the government changed and another political party became the new government. So we used that pretty much. So we said, okay, the previous government wasn't working with us very well. So now you have to make a stand and make changes, sustainable changes in the Roma community. So I'm guessing maybe the things that led to some positive outcomes in our concrete case was the combination of our journalistic work and the fact that we're the only Roma portal in Montenegro, and the fact that the government changed. So use every possibility there is out there. Use every chance. I'm guessing that was our recipe.
Thank you, Nevenka. We'll go on to the next question, which is by Vijay Lakshmi Joshi. All panelists narrated the situation, but whatever interventions and protests and issues raised by so many human rights organizations were not mentioned. Why? The second question from Vijay Lakshmi is about the obligatory responsibilities of the Indian government. The second part, perhaps Mohsin can take that, and you've already mentioned, Mohsin, the responsibilities, but perhaps you can just quickly go over the main legal obligations that the Indian government have within this issue. And also, if anyone wants to take the first question, they're free to.
Thank you, Vijay Lakshmi. As if I start talking about the list of obligatory or legally obligatory responsibilities under domestic and international law, I think I could just spend like a few days talking about all the responsibilities, most of which have been violated. And then broadly, I think the first is just answerability. I think that's just a question of decency rather than a question of obligation. There have been a number of domestic and international organizations, special rapporteurs, UN agencies, human rights agencies that have consistently raised serious concerns, and not necessarily in sort of an antagonistic, politically antagonistic manner, but just a question of what are you doing? What are the processes? What are the consequences? And for the Indian state not to even respond to them with any amount of seriousness is a matter of great concern. So when we talk about liminality, a major cause of that liminality is the lack of interest of the Indian state to even clearly point out what exactly the Indian state is doing from its own perspective. Is it about citizenship? Is it not? Will it lead to statelessness? What will be the next step? And these are questions that are interesting and important to a large number of people. The Indian state has diplomatically, as Tanya said, not even raised this issue with Bangladesh. It said it's a domestic matter. But citizenship and nationality on Indian state's own terms is not a domestic matter. This is exactly what they're saying, which is the opposite of what they are saying domestically. So I think that is the biggest sort of concern. Once that is not fulfilled, then practically no other obligation, international obligation in particular, is fulfilled as well, right? As in, you're not then caring about human rights obligations, about due process, about transparency, about right to nationality, about right to life, respect for family, privacy, absolutely nothing. The other problem, and just to sort of quickly summarize it, is that and again, that is something that hopefully came across during the panel discussion, is that the Indian courts unfortunately have not done a good job of even framing in domestic law, constitutional law terms, what India's obligations are. As if the question of citizenship identity really exists outside the framework of domestic law as well. So whether it is about detention, what are the rights and justifications, whether it is about due process in foreigners' tribunals, forget about everything, even the fundamental questions about the constitutional validity of citizenship law is not decided. And it's on the basis of precisely those undecided questions that the NRC process happened. So the issue over here is that even before we come to pointing out the clear obligations, there is absolutely no transparency about what kind of framework India domestically or internationally is ready to accept, because there's no conversation. And to make the Indian state acknowledge it publicly and to answer will be the first biggest challenge.
Thank you, Mohsen. Is there anyone else who would like to sort of address the first question, maybe, which is, I'll repeat it, all panelists narrated the situation, but whatever interventions and protests and issues raised by so many human rights organizations were not mentioned. Why? Just one little quick thing that I want to say to this question is, in our experience, protests against the NRC process or the citizenship determination crisis in Assam have been next to nil in our experience. I mean, most of the protests have centered on CAA or the prospective All India NRC. There have been localized demonstrations from certain groups in Assam, but given the sort of overwhelming social constituency and the political constituency that the NRC process has and the foreigner tribunals process has in Assam, the popular resistance on that front has been few and far between so far. And I hope this changes, but it is precisely through conversations like this where we foreground the traumatic experience and the extreme discrimination that people are facing because of this processes that we hope would trigger sort of a much more popular sort of resistance or protests against this. But this is exactly why such conversations are critical. We have one last question after which we hope to close the webinar because we are well over time. This question is from Mirza Lutfur Rahman, and I know Mirza has been working on this issue from the ground in Assam. He runs an NGO called Ango Michang. Perhaps Tanya, you could take this question. So far as I know, the released detainees in Assam are not getting vaccinated due to lack or issues about their documents. So my question here is, what is the way with these people? In what way will these people get vaccinated?
I think it is pretty easy for the state, and it's the one thing we need here is a political will, because these are already documented citizens, right? The state have all the reports about them. The very fact that they came out from the detention camp means that like they are the citizens, they are the people who lived in this country. Maybe the citizenship is in question, but their whereabouts is never the fact that they had been been into one of the jails and camps of this state, that means they were people who resided under this country. So one thing which will solve the problem is political will, just a direction from the maybe the Ministry of Border or any other ministries which are concerned in this case. They just can make a notification, and this will be done. I think also, like, I think it can be done locally also. The people should go to the police station and get one of their IDs, and it can be done all in that way also. But the thing we need is political will and will from the institutions which are involved in the vaccination process.
Thanks, Tanya. Very rightly said. I think it all ultimately boils down to political will. If the state really wants to help these people, they can by any way they want to. We finally reached
so yeah, I just want to add one more thing. Just for 2 seconds. So this another question, another point which we did not discuss in whole time is that, we have seen, like, these days there are so many discussions around Pegasus and all, and how this state has become a surveillance state, and how state is doing surveillance on its citizen. So there is another kind of surveillance or another kind of cyber theft of individual identities, I will say, is happening in Assam, which is like the people who have whose name were been dropped from the first NRC list, the 40 lakhs people. They had to give their biometric details to the state, right? They had to go to the biometric centers set by the state, and they have given all their biometric data there. And now, like, their biometric data has been kept in hold, and they don't know what is happening with their biometric identifications and who have access to it. They don't know whether the companies, it has been done through Wipro, and there are other companies involved in it. So the people are now in dark, like, what is happening to their biometric identifications, and when will those data will be released, or whether who are the companies which have access to it. And because of that, I think it's a very threat to their identities, and it is a threat to the 40 identities of all those 40 lakhs people. And also because of this, another thing is happening, that they can't use their biometric data in any other identification process. They can't do their Aadhars, and so they are deprived of one identification document right there, right, because of the states not doing anything about their biometric data. So this is why another sorts of people who might not be the detainees, but whose name has been appeared in the second list, in the 19 lakhs list, might be their name is there in the NRC, but still their biometric data is held by the state, and it is a very grave situation, I think. And we also need, like, certain directions, certain notifications regarding that, and it should be solved as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that out. This is an extremely crucial issue, and I think we can have a whole different session on this altogether. Much has been made out about the technological, bureaucratic efficiency of the NRC process and how Wipro has been involved in making the list and all. But with great technology, big tech, comes concerns about privacy, right? And this is a very, very fundamental concern that the conversation, I'm glad, has begun now. I believe there was a Twitter campaign few days back on the Aadhaar issue. So I'm glad people are talking about it now, and should be talked about more, I believe. But thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Mohsin, Pamela, and Nevenka, for your very, very incisive remarks. I mean, all of us have been working on this issue, including me, but every time I listen to people like you, I discover new facets about this entire issue. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I also would like to thank our audience who has been patiently watching the session and answering and asking questions and engaging. Thank you so much for this. And finally, of course, I would really like to thank Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion, Alena and Otolin. This really wouldn't have been possible without your support, this launch and webinar. So thank you so much. And of course, I have to thank Ravi for putting this entire thing together and leading from the front if I may say so. And he's always, I mean, to me personally, I see him as a mentor. I must honestly confess, because Ravi has been at it for a long time, and I'm glad he's been at the forefront of, as Pamela also said, documenting, not just raising conversations, and documenting through his organization Daji. And I think the kind of work that Daji is doing on statelessness in Assam is seminal, and it has to be replicated in other forms. So thank you very much for this, and thank you very much for joining us. I hope all of you have a good day. I hope you stay safe, and I really hope this pandemic gets over for all of us, and the interventions that we make on statelessness becomes a little easier for us, and when the pall of the pandemic goes away. So thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you.